Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming along. My name is Geoff White. I'm an investigative journalist, and I've covered technology on behalf of Channel 4 News, BBC News, and most recently the Sunday Times. And I'm here to talk to you this afternoon about hackers, journalists, and the ethical swamp. Firstly, most importantly, thank you for turning up. Thank you for being here in the room. A lot of the places I talk, there's only one stage, basically, so the audience only have one option, and it's you. I'm aware that you guys have lots of options you could have gone to, so I do appreciate you choosing this one. Thank you very much. And I also want to sort of map out why I wanted to do the talk that I'm going to do. I've just finished writing a book about cybercrime. It's going to be out next July. It'll be called crime.com. That's the plug. There will be no more. One of the chapters I wrote in the book was called Weaponized Data. And it's about exactly this issue, about the growing confluence between the worlds of computer hacking, by which I include the full gamut from grey hat to black hat to white hat and everything in between, and news media. And it was the most difficult chapter in the book to write. Most of the chapters are about, well, they're just about hacking stories. So, criminal group A breaks in over here, steals a whole bunch of credit cards, leaks them on the web. What happens next? How do they do it? The ethics of that aren't complicated. It's not easy, not difficult to work out who's the bad guy in that perspective. But the weaponizing data chapter, it was very, very tricky. There was a lot of nuances going on. It wasn't always easy to work out what the right thing to do was. It was, as the title of the talk suggests, an ethical swamp. And I want to be absolutely upfront at the beginning about this. This is not a talk that ends with a solution. There is no package I'm going to give you that you can download and that will fix this. There is no patch for this problem. The best analogy I can draw is it's like case law. So in the legal affairs business, you have a judge who makes a decision over here about a particular case, and then you have another judge who makes a decision about a similar case over here, and you think, well, maybe the law's in the middle somewhere. Another judge makes a decision over here, and over time you get dots on the graph, and you draw a line of best fit through those dots, and that's kind of where the law is. But that doesn't mean that a judge in future is going to make another completely outlandish decision, as sometimes they do, and the line goes a bit wavy and so on. So what we're trying to do, I think, in this perspective is to draw a line of best fit. The problem is, because of the speed with which news media is evolving and the speed with which tech security is evolving, the line of best fit is trying to find its way through a whole bunch of dots that are all over the map. So my job over the next 40 minutes or so is just to try and pick on a few dots on the map so far, see what the line of best fit might be, and then at the end we can have a chat about it. Sound good? Like you have an option. Anyway, right, so I'm going to start. First thing I want to talk about is this harnessing the media, this concept of harnessing the media. This is the idea that the news media is a system, and like any system, it can be hacked. You can find your way around it, understand how it works, and subvert it, and in some cases, manipulate it entirely. I'm going to use the example of this chap here, who some of you will know. This is Jake Davis, now a cybersecurity consultant and semi-professional cat wrangler. Years ago, in his formative years, Jake was a founder member of a hacking group called LulzSec, who you'll almost certainly remember. They were a spin-off, a splinter group from the anonymous hacking movement. The reason I was interested in LulzSec, and the reason I found LulzSec so fascinating, was that they, more than any other hacking group, I think at the time, understood on a really innate, really deep level exactly how news media works, exactly how my business works, which was slightly frightening. They not only understood it, they knew how to adapt it, how to tweak it, how to manipulate it, how to achieve their ends through it. In one notable example, of course, taking down an entire company, HB Gary Federal, through the course of their hacks. So Jake and his LulzSec buddies at one stage realized they could hack into News International, publisher of the Sun newspaper, the Times newspaper, and they realized they could get access to News International's content management system, which is the system that News International uses to decide what's going to go onto its newspaper's websites. So LulzSec realized they could effectively change the paper's websites. So they decided they would change the front page of the Sun newspaper, and famously that's exactly what they did. This was the front page that they put up. So this reports the death, apparently, of Rupert Murdoch, owner, boss of News International, and ultimately boss of Sun newspaper and Times newspaper. Now, there are a couple of dead giveaways in this article that it's not the real thing. The eagle-eyed will have spotted. There's an apostrophe missing from media moguls. Very good at hacking, not so good at grammar. There were other giveaways in the article as well. Murdoch, aged 80, has said to have, again, not great grammar, and he was meant to have taken Palladium and stumbled into his topiary garden. Palladium and topiary being the hacker handles for two members of LulzSec. Topiary was, in fact, Jake Davis's hacker name. So there's a few clues in the article that this wasn't legit, this wasn't the real thing. And so far, so fun. Hack into the Sun's front page, change the front page, and so on. What I hadn't realized until I interviewed Jake for the book was the full extent of how far they were going to take this. You see, they hadn't just decided to hack into the Sun's front page and change it, they were going to do that at exactly the right point in the Sky News newspaper review. For those of you not versed in Sky News' affairs, this is a section of the program. It's on about 10 or 11 at night when they get the next day's front pages, and they get a couple of journalists to talk through what's on the next day's front pages. So the idea, as I understand it, was they were not just going to hack the Sun's front page to report the death of Rupert Murdoch. They were going to put that page live at exactly the point in the Sky News newspaper review when the reporter turned around and said, well, what's on tomorrow's Sun's front page? Oh my God, my boss is dead. And then I think the idea was then to turn that into the LulzSec Twitter feed so that they would be live tweeting the reaction to the Sky News review live on the LulzSec Twitter feed, there were circles within circles within circles. What I find incredible about this is, just as a show of hands, before I started talking about it, how many of you are familiar with the Sky News newspaper review? And keep your hands up if you watch it. Yeah, exactly. It is not exactly appointment to viewing the Sky News newspaper review. No, I'm not bashing Sky News here, but it's not like you all rush home to tune into this thing. This is niche. Even among the news business, this is niche. Not only were Jake and his buddies prepared to hack into this particular bit of news output, they knew exactly when it was, and they were prepared to go to prison to do it. So the News International hack was one of the hacks for which LulzSec was sentenced. Jake Davis sentenced to 2 years in a youth offender institution for those hacks, this one among others. Other members of LulzSec did custodial time for this. They not only understood the news media, it was important enough to them to risk losing their liberty in order to hack it. I find that quite interesting. There's a book by a woman called Whitney Phillips called This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things. It's a great book, by the way, if you haven't read it, so it's really worth a read. It's about trolling culture, and it's an academically very rigorous interrogation of troll culture and how that works. And what's interesting is a lot of the things she talks about with troll culture stretch over into the kind of hacking that in certain levels LulzSec were trying to do. And Whitney Phillips talks about the interaction between trolls, which I would extend to the hacking community in certain sectors, and the news media. She talked about this symbiotic relationship. And she wrote this, which I thought was quite revealing. She says, by reporting on the story, or non-story as the case may be, media outlets, people like Sky News, BBC, Channel 4 News, give the trolls what they want, namely exposure and laughs, the kind of thing that LulzSec would have got out of the Sun newspaper hack. And participating media get what they want, namely a story and eyeballs to commodify through advertisements. What Phillips is writing about here is the confluence between those two things. And she has a name for this symbiotic relationship between news media and computer hackers. Her words, not mine. So that's the idea of harnessing the media. I want to move on next to the idea of leaking strategically. This is the idea that instead of just dumping the information and walking away, which, from my view, had been the sort of trend of hacking, towards selectively leaking information. So you get hold of a wad of information, you don't just dump it, you work out what you've got, and you leak it in the way that is going to do most damage to your target. Again, something LulzSec had worked on, but for me, the piquant example in this particular area is the hacking of Ashley Madison. Just a quick show of hands if you're a member of Ashley Madison. One day that will work. Oh, we've got one taker there, yeah. The first one of any conference I've ever done to put their hand bravely up and say, for the unappraised, Ashley Madison is a site for people who want to have extramarital affairs. That's how the site works. The chap pictured here is Noel Biderman, who was at the time chief executive of Avid Life Media, the owners of Ashley Madison. Actually, it's interesting. Writing a book, one of the things that's good about it is journalists, we work at a pace, and if journalists get things wrong or miss things out, please understand that it's not always easy to keep on top of everything and get everything right. You are working at a pace, and you miss stuff. Stuff just flies by, and you just don't quite clock it. And one of the things I hadn't quite clocked was that Avid Life Media, who run Ashley Madison, it's not the only site they run. They have a sort of suite of sites. So Ashley Madison is for people who want to have extramarital affairs. There's also Established Men, for older men who are looking for younger women, sort of a sugar daddy operation. There's also Cougar Life, which is for older women in search of energetic younger men, is the quote. So there's a staple of sites that they run. So hackers break into Ashley Madison, they steal a whole bunch of sensitive information, and this was how it's reported on the website of Brian Krebs, noted security researcher and journalist. And the impact team, as they called themselves, said, look, we've got a whole stash of sensitive data, and if Ashley Madison doesn't close down within a month, we are going to leak this incredibly sensitive information. By the way, they said they wanted Ashley Madison to close, that obviously got the headlines. They also, as a sideline, they wanted Established Men to close down, but Cougar Life could stay up. So. And I'm aware the phrase "stay up" is probably a bad choice of words in that respect. So this is what happens. So the stuff gets leaked. And sure enough, they go through with their threat. They're going to leak the sensitive information of people, and a month later they did exactly that. And that led to headlines like this one on the Daily Mirror: 1.2 million love cheat Brits are about to be exposed. Love cheat Brits. It's a classic tabloid headline. But the Daily Mirror were not the only newspaper reporting this. There was a lot of headlines of 38 million users of Ashley Madison are about to have their data leaked. 38 million users of this love cheat website are about to be outed. The problem with those headlines was they weren't entirely true. As I'm sure you're aware, it was possible to end up on the Ashley Madison database without ever having used the website at all. So I could take your email address, put it into the Ashley Madison system, sign you up, and without your agreement or your knowledge, suddenly you're on the Ashley Madison database. And this led to all sorts of problems with people being identified as being Ashley Madison users when in fact they'd never been anywhere near the site. What was interesting about this was the order in which the hackers worked, because they had all the information from inside of Ashley Madison, and they made a decision about it. They didn't just dump it all. They made some careful decisions about it. They leaked the user database of millions and millions of people first. And then when Ashley Madison remained resolutely online, they waited a week, and the next thing they released was the corporate emails from within Avid Life Media, the guys who run Ashley Madison. And what the corporate emails revealed was how the internal operations of the company worked. And that revealed what a lot of us, I think, would be sharp practice. Notably, it revealed the fact that on Ashley Madison, the vast majority of users were men. No surprise there. But what had happened in order to address this was the company had started using automated software. So when you're a man and you sign up to Ashley Madison, as you sign up, you get messages from a woman who appears to be a real woman who wants to interact with you. And in fact, this was the work of the fembots. This was automated software that replies automatically to men. You may laugh, but I've just won a bet there. So this, of course, is still from Austin Powers. These were not the fembots that were being used by Ashley Madison. They were computer software, just to make that absolutely crystal clear. Now, I find this interesting from a media perspective, from a journalist perspective, because what the hackers have done is user database first, user database, and then corporate emails second. Now, for me, I would have done it the other way around. I actually wouldn't have released the user database at all, because that's, personal people's sensitive information. Sticking that online is not ethically the right thing to do, as far as I'm concerned. The corporate emails is interesting, because the corporate emails tells me something about the company behind it. And to know why I'm more interested in the corporate emails than I am the juicy database of users, you have to understand how journalists, particularly investigative journalists, approach stories when we cover them. What we're often looking for as journalists in a story is what's called institutional failure. Put simply, institutional failure is this: a bad person doing a bad thing might be a story. But a good person, or somebody who should be a good person doing a bad thing, is a much bigger story. So do you remember a while ago there was a whale in the Thames? Do you remember the whale in the Thames story? Whale in the Thames story. It's surprising, but it's not very sinful. These are the two axes of news media, by the way. There's sin and there's surprise. And a story that's very surprising is high on the surprise axis, like the whale in the Thames. A story that's very sinful, a multiple murderer murdering people, is high on the sin axis. The story you're looking for as a journalist, and I'm being completely open and honest with you here, is a story that is both surprising and sinful. This is how institutional failure works. Love cheats on a love cheat website, love cheating on each other, well, that's bad people doing a bad thing. Sinful, not surprising. People who run a publicly listed company that's making megabucks out of running dating websites around the world, executives in that company doing sharp practice to cheat the love cheats, well, that's not only on the sin axis, that's high on the surprise axis. That's institutional failure. So from my perspective, the love bots represent institutional failure. That's my reading of the story. So that's why I would have gone for the corporate emails first. Doesn't matter, though, what I think, does it? I'm not in charge. I don't have the data. The hackers have the data. The hackers have stolen the information, and they are setting the agenda for us to follow. In the news media, we had no option what to cover. We covered whatever they leaked first, and they leaked the user database first, so that's the thing that got the most coverage. The hackers are setting the agenda. They're working out strategically how they're going to leak this information. And in a way, you could argue their judgment was right, because that user database got headlines around the world, got them on every front page. So we have the idea of harnessing the media, the idea that the media is a machine that can be hacked, the idea that there are ways to subvert this machine. You've got the idea of leaking strategically, the idea of triaging what you've got, dumping it selectively. And if you put both of those together, you get harnessing the media and leaking strategically, and that is the Sony Pictures Entertainment case. As you'll well be aware, late 2014, Sony gets hacked into. The hackers did two things. They ruined parts of Sony's networks. They took computers down and used wiper software to wipe the machines. But they also stole tens of thousands of incredibly sensitive emails from within Sony. And looked at in the context of this harnessing the media, leaking strategically, this gets quite interesting what happens next. Because you see, they didn't just dump the information and wait for journalists to find it. They actually actively approached journalists and encouraged them to go and find it and report on them. This was an email that went out to journalists at various news outlets. Hi, I'm the boss of GOP, which stood for Guardians of Peace, the group that at that time had claimed responsibility for the Sony hack. A few days ago, we told you the fact that we'd released Sony pictures, including Annie, Fury, and still Alice to the web. They can be obtained through an internet search. We're about to release Sony pictures data to the web. The volume is under 100 terabytes. And sure enough, they did. And they were emailing journalists with links where they could find this information and the password to get hold of it. Now, what's interesting is, who did these emails go to? Not me, that's for sure. They didn't email people, for example, at Channel 4 News, at the BBC. As far as I'm aware, these didn't pitch up at the Times, the New York Times, or the Washington Post, or whatever. These emails went out to smaller, online, newer publications. So these emails went out, for example, to Gawker Media, to Fusion.net. And I'm not being pejorative about that. These are good publications. It's just they're smaller, newer publications. But they're smaller, and they're newer, and they're hungrier. These publications are very interested in salacious leaks like this, and they want to get them out, and they want to make a big splash. Because if you have the right thing on your new website, you can suddenly go up the rankings. So when the hackers sent these things out, they sent them to people at those smaller publications. What happens after that is that bigger publications start to see the stories come out. So, for example, this was a story that appeared in Splinter. Kevin Roos, the journalist who wrote this, was one of the journalists who received that email that I showed you on the previous page. Hacked documents reveal a Hollywood studio's stunning gender and race gap. Kevin Roos had looked through the data, found that there was a gender and race pay gap, and he'd reported it. Hands up if you've heard of Splinter. Exactly, neither would I. I'm not having a pop at Splinter, it's just they were a smaller publication. That is hugely significant, because it means the journalists are targeting the smaller bunch first. You grow your small audience, and then, as the likes of the New York Times and the LA Times and Sydney Morning Herald see what's happening, they go, hang on, these guys are reporting this story. We have to get on this. We should report this as well. Smaller publications give bigger publications cover to get on board and to start reporting. The wave starts to build. You can't build a wave as a tidal wave, you have to build it small. You start small with these guys, and as it gets bigger, the bigger publications get on, and soon it becomes a wave that can't be resisted. So, for example, in the Ashley Madison case, at one stage it's reported that Ashley Madison was approaching media companies and saying, could you please stop using our data? This is our intellectual property that you're reporting on that's been hacked from our company. Stop it. Did it work? Did it bollocks? No, of course it didn't work. The wave is too big. All the publications are reporting and you get a mass effect. What's interesting about this case is it started small. It sounded to me like the hackers knew what they were doing to build that up. The other thing that happened that was really interesting about this from a strategic leaking point of view is the effect that it had on the lady on the left of this picture. That's Amy Pascal. She was the co-chairperson of Sony Pictures Entertainment. Now, the hackers didn't leak all the information at once. They'd learned that lesson. You leak it strategically. They've got tens of thousands of emails, loads of juicy documents. You don't blow your wad all at once. You leak it strategically, bit by bit. There were 8 leaks in the Sony Pictures Entertainment case, scheduled leaks. And the hackers online were saying, this is going to come up, this will be the next thing. They were emailing journalists saying, we're about to release something else. A carefully staged, managed set of leaks. But what was interesting was where they were going with this. Because it wasn't like they got all the information, divided it into 8 equal sections and just leaked it sort of at random. They leaked things to lead towards a crescendo, a spectacular. And they had in their sights these 2 folks here. The guy on the right, the left, by the way, your right, is Michael Linton, the other co-chairperson of Sony. They knew that they had Amy Pascal's emails, because they had everybody's emails from Sony. So what they did was they waited. They could have done that initially, they waited. And while they waited, Amy Pascal is taking a bigger and bigger role in sorting out the mess. At this stage, Sony's got thousands and thousands of computers offline. Reportedly, they were paying people using checks in the car park because the payroll system had collapsed. They'd had to ferret BlackBerries out of the basement to give people. The company is going through a tough, tough time. Not to mention the staff thinking, what the hell are you doing with our data security? Amy Pascal is taking a leading role, reassuring the staff and trying to say, look, we're going to sort this out. But also reassuring external people and saying, don't worry, Sony Pictures Entertainment is sorting this out. Now, what's happening there all the way along is that Amy Pascal, somebody who most of us probably wouldn't have been that familiar with, is getting closer and closer and closer to center stage. She's getting further and further into the spotlight because she's the one dealing with it. She's the one on the front foot. What she didn't know, but what the hackers did, they've got all of her emails. So what she's standing on is a trapdoor. And in December, they let it drop. They leaked all of her emails. And, like a lot of us, Amy Pascal sends emails at work that, in hindsight, you probably wouldn't have sent in the clear light of day. Unfortunately for Amy Pascal, unlike us, the people she's dealing with are internationally famous film stars. So when this came out, it was a disaster, and Amy Pascal resigned in the wake of it. Michael Linton, as far as I'm aware, was next. They had a trapdoor for him. But Sony at the time pulled the interview, the film that was apparently the cause of all of this stuff. And so Michael Linton emails, as far as I'm aware, never got released. So that's how it worked from that perspective. So you've got the leaking strategically and the harnessing of the media. I want to talk now about another example, which I call the Interflora of data leaks, which I'll explain the title as we go through. This is going to be about the case of Mossack Fonseca, the stories of Mossack Fonseca. Put your hands up if you remember the Mossack Fonseca stories. Oh, yep, okay, yep. I forgive the rest of you for not remembering it. It wasn't an easy set of stories to get through Mossack Fonseca. I remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when this story broke. I was in the Channel 4 newsroom, and I was doing basically nothing. And the reason for that, just to defend myself on this, was that it was 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening. The program was ready to go. We knew what we were going to report on the program. It's all in the running order. And frankly, we were just twiddling our thumbs waiting to go home. It's 7 p.m. It's Sunday. Can we please go home? And suddenly, on the Guardian website, this story drops. A story of major international importance. A leak from an offshore consultancy firm with all sorts of allegations in it. And we say, oh my gosh, so we start going on the Guardian website, we start looking, and then it's being reported in other places around the world. And I just remember thinking, 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening, why? Why on earth would you put a story like this out at that time? Just to let you know, 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening is the worst time to leak a story, to put out a story. Because it's too late to set the news agenda for the weekend, but it's too early because it might get overtaken in Monday morning's rush. 7 p.m. on a Sunday is a disaster. Why are The Guardian putting out such a significant story out at 7 p.m. on a Sunday evening? I think it's because The Guardian weren't in charge of how this would be leaked, when they would actually be able to publish it. Because the story behind Mossack Fonseca was this. Someone who had information from Mossack Fonseca and objected to what the company did. Mossack Fonseca, by the way, serviced clients around the world and did things that I think a lot of us would think were unethical and underhanded. Moving money around, concealing money, setting up companies within companies, all of that kind of stuff. Somebody had an objection to this, got a whole bunch of information from Mossack Fonseca, and they took it to journalists at the Süddeutsche Zeitung, an august and venerable publication with a long history in data leaks and investigative journalism. Süddeutsche Zeitung looked at this and thought, there's tons of stuff here. It's way too big, really, for us. And it's a story that's way outside of just German borders, or even European borders. So the Süddeutsche Zeitung worked with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists to put out this information. And what the ICIJ did was they packaged this stuff up into bits that were relevant for different territories. So they sent the American stuff to a publication in the US, they sent the British stuff to a publication in Britain, and so on, and Spain, and Russia, and Iceland, and so on. And they said, look, okay, we're going to parcel this stuff up, and we're all going to publish at the same time. And that's exactly what happened. So The Guardian were publishing at 7 in the evening because that's when everybody else around the world was triggered to publish. Now, regardless of whether you remember the contents of the Mossack Fonseca stories or not, and I don't think many of us do, what's interesting here is not only did the ICIJ manage to keep the information secure, which when you're sending it to jurisdictions like Russia is not easy at all, and also sending it to journalists and getting journalists to keep it secure, which is also difficult, they managed to convince journalists around the world in multiple publications to all obey the same embargo and the same deadline and to leak simultaneously. Now, I don't know whether you know many journalists, but trying to get journalists from the same publication in the same room at the same time is often quite difficult. The idea they coordinated people around the world to simultaneously do this is quite incredible. And what it created was this. From then on, you've got a situation where if you're a hacker and you've got a database full of damaging information that has global significance, you no longer have to call a guy in this country over here, a reporter in that country over there, a woman in this country over here, a journalist there, a publication here. You no longer have to do that. All you have to do is one phone call to your local outlet that's linked to the ICIJ. If you're in the US, you would call this publication. If you're in the UK, you call The Guardian. If you're in Germany, you call Süddeutsche Zeitung. And they will link you up with the ICIJ, who will then distribute it all internationally. This, in case you don't know, is the model that Interflora use. If you want to send flowers to Sydney, you call your local London florist, and they're linked in with the florist in Sydney. It's an Interflora network. And once that's set, once that precedent's set, it can be used again and again and again. It wasn't long before we saw the next story. This was the Paradise Papers story. This was another offshore consultancy firm. In fact, several firms, notably one of them was Appleby, who were, again, carrying out things which the journalists felt were underhanded and they felt were unethical in terms of their services for their clients, in terms of moving money around and so on. Again, a source approaches the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Again, the Süddeutsche Zeitung goes to the ICIJ and gets it all out. And again, journalists around the world work with the data, huge amounts of it, and they all publish simultaneously. There are multiple stories flowing out of this, dozens and dozens of stories around the world. But there were some differences in this example compared to the example of Mossack Fonseca. In the Mossack Fonseca case, Süddeutsche Zeitung had a certain amount of contact with the person who was leaking the information, and the person who was leaking the information had given a justification and said, I object ethically to what this company is doing. So I understand it in this case, in the Paradise Papers case, the person who leaked the information leaked it and then stepped away and practically disappeared. And it was never entirely clear who that person was or what their motivations were. Now, the BBC were quite clear about this, let's be honest. The BBC said, we don't know the source of this information. We don't know who's given it over. But we've checked the information out. We are sure the information is true, is legitimate, and we think this is in enough of the public interest that we are right to report this. So it's not that they've gone off pop and just published it. They have made those decision processes, but they've made those decisions on the basis they don't know where the information has come from. And that's the situation we're in. So you add all of this together. You take harnessing the media, working out that the media is a system and that you can hack that system. You take the idea of strategically leaking a bit by bit to get the maximum damage to your target. And you take the idea that you can convince journalists around the world to publish, even if they don't know the source of the information and the motivations of that source. And what you get is, of course, the 2016 US presidential election. Terrifying, isn't it, to think we may see the same faces on the campaign trail next year? Well, there will be. Put your hands up if you think Hillary will win in the end. Oh, God, not good. Paging Hillary Clinton. OK, so maybe we won't see the same faces next year. Look, I'm sure you're all aware, during the 2016 presidential election, of course we all know, the Hillary Clinton campaign itself and the Democratic National Committee, who run the Democrats' political affairs, were both hacked into. The US intelligence agencies are now convinced and put out a criminal complaint to the effect that this was on part of the Russian government. What's interesting is looking at it from the perspective of what we've looked at, leaking strategically, media manipulation, and so on. So this was investigated by CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike put out a blog about it and said, here's what we think. Washington Post picked up that blog and then reported it with interviews from the Democrats, and the Washington Post were pretty unequivocal. This is Russian government interference in the Democrats. The day after that appeared in the Washington Post, this appears, which is a blog written by a person calling themselves Geoff 2.0, who says, no, it wasn't the Russian government, it was me on my own, I'm a Romanian hacker, all me on my onesie. And Geoff 2.0 then starts leaking out information. Again, leaking strategically. A little bit of information here, a little bit of information there. Sure enough, as we saw in the Sony case, journalists start to get messages saying, hey, have you thought about reporting this? Here's some information over here you could use. You start to see that kind of manipulation of the news media. And you start to see people in the media picking up these stories and reporting them without necessarily being entirely clear who the source of the information was. One of those outlets publishing this stuff was, of course, WikiLeaks. Geoff 2.0 said that he or she or they were working with WikiLeaks and they would publish, and sure enough, that's exactly what they did. WikiLeaks made a searchable archive of tens of thousands of stolen emails from the Democrats. What's significant about this isn't, I mean, that's what WikiLeaks do. They get hold of leaked information and they make it searchable. That's their job in a certain way. What's interesting about this is the time when this happened. If you think about those strategic leaks, this was the 22nd of July 2016 this stuff went live. That is several days before the Democratic National Convention. The Democratic National Convention is when the Democrats are supposed to come together, heal the rift between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, decide who's going to be their candidate for the White House, and jettison them towards the White House to victory. Instead, the thing turned into a bloodbath. So the chairperson of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, resigned. She wasn't the only one. They lost during 1 week chairperson, chief executive, chief marketing officer, and chief financial officer. That is an organizational decapitation. And it happened because the timing of that leak was so accurate and so devastating. Now, what's interesting is afterwards, it was attributed, of course, to the Russian government by the US intelligence agencies. There is some dispute around that, but the US intelligence agencies seem pretty clear on that, to the so-called Fancy Bears group, a name that they didn't originally assign themselves, but they seem to have adopted afterwards. And of course, as that happens, as more and more fire and more heat comes around that, and more people seem to be saying, well, hang on, this does look like the work of Russian government hackers, questions start getting asked to this chap, David Davis. Now, of course, this is Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks. Sorry, that joke works a lot better with mainly British, but anyway, never mind. Julian Assange gets asked about this and says, look, you've published all of this stuff. This, if it is true, and the US government's, US intelligence agency's assessments is true, this was done by the Russian government and was done to destabilize an election. Therefore, you, WikiLeaks, have been sort of part of that. Consciously or subconsciously, we don't know. And Assange's comment on this was really interesting. This was his response. He said, in order to prevent a distraction attack against our publications. Now, the distraction attack he's talking about there is people saying, where did you get this information, and is it the Russian government, right? Personally, I don't regard that as a distraction attack. Where did you get the info? I think that's a fair question, but we disagree. He calls it a distraction attack. We've had to come out and say, no, it's not a state party, i.e. it's not the Russian government. Stop trying to distract in that way and pay attention to the content of the publications. Don't ask about the origin of this stuff, just look at the stuff itself. He and I disagree on this. I think you do need to ask where the stuff has come from, and I think that's a very, very important question to ask, particularly in a significant leak like this. But I think I'm the outlier. I think I'm the odd one out, and I'm the anachronism. Because if you think about what Julian Assange is saying here, it's slightly similar to what the BBC was saying with the Paradise Papers. They didn't know where the stuff had come from. They couldn't know where the stuff had come from, and so they couldn't know the motivation, even vaguely, of the person who'd leaked it. But they felt the content of the publications was strong enough, and that's exactly what Julian Assange is saying here as well. Look at the content of the publications. And I've spoken to other investigative journalists who feel exactly the same. I've said to them, are you concerned about this, that you might end up getting your strings pulled by people you don't know who's pulling your strings? And the comments I've had from journalists have been, no, if the data's good, I'll go with it. I just can't. Maybe I'm the outlier. Maybe when I'm gone, everybody will feel the same. But there's something, if somebody's pulling your strings, you want to know who's doing it, surely. Just by the way, after the DNC hack, a new chairperson was brought in to oversee things, a woman called Donna Brazil, who wrote a book afterwards called Hacks, all about it. And there's a great quote in Hacks. She talks about what happened during the time. She says, after the whole thing emerged that, they've been hacked and so on, she said, no one suspected that they, i.e. the people who broke into the Democrats, had the political sophistication to weaponize the information they had gathered from our servers, understanding exactly when they should release which emails they had stolen. She goes on to say, our hacking was unlike anything members of our expert task force had ever seen. I know hindsight is 50-50, but really, I do question what news they were watching, because it was unlike anything they'd ever seen. They clearly hadn't been watching the activities of people like Jake Davis and Lulzsec, who'd shown exactly how you could manipulate the media to your ends. They hadn't been seeing the work of the Ashley Madison hackers, the Impact team, who'd shown exactly how you can triage and selectively release data to do the maximum damage to your target. They hadn't seen the hacking of Sony Pictures Entertainment, where they were both harnessing the media and emailing journalists directly, and triaging the information to get maximum damage to the target. And they hadn't been looking at the Paradise Papers example, where journalists are ready, if the public interest justifies it, to publish information without knowing the source and even the motivations of the source of the data. There's just one last one I want to come on to, which is the issue of Tainted Leaks. This was the title of a report by a Canadian research bunch called Citizen Lab, who you're probably very familiar with, and they released a report called Tainted Leaks, which is all about this particular case. This centered around a guy called David Satter, a writer called David Satter. He covers Russian government affairs. These are some of his books, and he on his website describes himself as telling the truth about one of the most monstrous regimes the world has ever known. As you can imagine, David Satter is not very popular among large sections of the Russian government. So David Satter one day in 2016 gets this, a request to reset his password. Somebody's stolen his password and he has to reset it. It's the classic phishing email, and it's very, very, very like the ones that were used to hack into the DNC. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will have spotted the obvious flaw here, which is that it's come from accounts.google.com.yandex.com, so actually it's a phishing email. Unfortunately, David Satter didn't spot that, so he went on to enter his password and, of course, gave that over to the hackers, and the hackers then have access to his Gmail account and all of the documents and emails therein. Now, just to put this in context, David Satter had been writing documents about the work of a thing called the Radio Liberty Russian Investigative Reporting Project. Radio Liberty is a partly US government-funded exercise. It is aiming to spread democratic values and liberal values around the world. It is, frankly, a propaganda organization. And when I say propaganda, that has sort of connotations like this, a sort of shadowy thing. It's not. They're completely open and honest about what they do. Radio Liberty is a thing to spread US values around the world. In the same way, for example, that in the UK, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office funds part of the BBC Worldwide, because they want to spread British democratic values around the world using an organ like the BBC. So these are sort of propaganda things, but sort of open propaganda where it's like, yeah, we're doing this, and you can find out all about that online. The Radio Liberty Project had decided there wasn't enough investigative reporting going on in Russia, and they wanted to address this. They wanted more investigative reporting to be going on in Russia. So they'd invented the Russian Investigative Reporting Project, and David Satter had written about it, and he'd said, the Radio Liberty Russian Investigative Reporting Project is gaining traction and producing significant journalism for the site of the Radio Liberty Russian service. That's what he'd written in his report. The people who'd stolen his documents were intending to leak them online, but they didn't just want to leak the documents that David had written. They wanted to change them to paint him in the worst light possible. This is what Citizen Lab have written about in their Tainted Leaks report. So they wanted to change this so that David Satter started to look a bit less reputable. Now, the problem the hackers have got is the Radio Liberty the Radio Liberty bit is out there. It's known about. It's a known quantity. You can Google it and you can find out about it. So they took out the references to it. They crossed out all the references to Radio Liberty. So what you're left with after that is the Russian Investigative Reporting Project is gaining traction and producing significant journalism. But without the Radio Liberty bit, what the heck is the Russian Investigative Reporting Project? That seems a bit it's a bit dark, isn't it? It's a bit shadowy. This was the idea, according to the Citizen Lab researchers, David Satter was a sort of force working in the background on this shadowy thing that couldn't be identified. David Satter had also written about articles that had been published by the reporting project, investigative journalism that had been out there. And he listed a whole bunch. He said, here's some articles that this project's done. It's done really well. The hackers added some. So he'd written about 14 articles. They added another 10 articles to his list. And these are the articles that they added. And what was interesting about those was a few, not all, but a few, were written by Alexei Navalny, who is a fierce critic of the Putin government. So the idea of this, the researchers believe, was to paint this Russian investigative reporting project as not just murky, but linked to enemies of the current Russian government. And again, it's not like they've blanketed Navalny's name all over it. They've just dropped in a few bits here and there. But this leaves the hackers with a bit of a problem, because what they're trying to do is leak David Satter's documents with the adjustments that they've made. But then they realized that they had to make other changes, more subtle changes. So David Satter had written this. In the first 9 months of 2016, 14 investigative or in-depth articles have been published under the aegis of the project. That's what he wrote. But think about it, the hackers have added another 10. So they've got to go back through and they've got to change it. So they took out 14 and they added 24, because that's commensurate with the ones that they've added. Let's tweak that, tweak that. But then there's another problem that they've got, which is he talked about the first 9 months of 2016, and he'd said, this is a following list of the articles that were published as of September the 30th. That's what he'd written. But of course, if you look at the ones the hackers added, the last one was published on October 18th. Oh, bugger. So they've got to go back through and they've got to change the text that he's written. And sure enough, that's exactly what they did. They got rid of in the first 9 months on September 30th, and they changed it to read 10 months on October 20th, because that matched the changes that they'd made back further in the document. I know this sounds obsessive that I'm getting into this, but I just find this fascinating, that they genuinely thought that when they leaked this document online, someone would go back through and go, oh, well, you've said 14 articles, actually it's 24, and I've been looking, it's October, and that they really thought somebody would go through in that granular type of detail. Especially given that David Satter, of course, has the original article and can compare what he wrote with what goes out online. But the bigger lesson is the changes that can be made to stuff that's leaked and leaked eventually to journalists, and by the way, the leaked, amended David Satter documents were leaked out into Russian media and appeared on at least one Russian government news website. The idea that when you receive as a journalist information, a juicy leak of data, that there can not just have been tweaks and changes made to it, but tweaks and changes that are so minute and so tiny that you have to go through word by fucking word to find where it might have been changed, that's slightly terrifying. Because I don't know about you, I don't know many journalists who would have that rigor to do that, given a lovely, juicy story presented to them. By the way, as a sidebar on this, I believe Sony Pictures Entertainment had a team of people who, whenever anything got released by the hackers, were going through it to see, does that email actually match the one that got sent? Do that for 20,000 emails. I'm sure there's software you can use, but think about this. Let's say it takes you a couple of days to go through. By the time you've discovered that this email over here has been minutely changed to give a slightly skewed impression, the story is out, has been reported around the world, and no journalist is interested in the truth anymore because they've moved on. That's the challenge you've got. Now, I'm not saying, and I want to be clear about this, and this is one of the difficult things in the chapter that I wrote about weaponized data, I am not saying that journalists can no longer work with anonymized sources and anonymous sources. That's increasingly important. I found it interesting in the Hong Kong protests how incredibly paranoid, rightly so, people in those Hong Kong protests have been about working with journalists and making sure journalists never know their identity, using those anonymized tools. So yes, anonymity for sources is still very important, as it always has been. And I'm not saying that journalists can't use what is frankly stolen data. Again, the brown envelope full of leaked information in the newsroom, that is the basis of some very, very good reporting over the years. What I am saying is this: I'm not entirely sure whether journalists have caught up to the fact that in today's world, you can have a malicious hacker, not a grey hat hacker, an absolute black hat hacker, who breaks in to an organization, a global organization, steals incredibly sensitive information, not necessarily corporately about that information, but employees' personal emails, and then has the option either of working with an international consortium of journalists who will leak them simultaneously around the world, destroying that organization potentially in the process, or the hacker can leak the stuff strategically online, let the audience and the public discover it, and at the end of all of this, the hacker can disappear back into the shadows and never be identified or have their motives questioned. That is a huge amount of power for one person to have, one group of people. Why does this matter to you? Well, think about it this way. News media, for all its failings, for all our failings, it is still a fantastic way to get the public interested in what you do. If you want the public to care about cybersecurity, about tech security, if you want the public to see corporate malpractice, corporate injustice, and government malpractice, the news media is still one of your best bets. We're very good at explaining what people do to the public, making a big fuss of it, making the public care, and forcing societies to change. News media can still do that. But those things work best when the audience, the public, who's watching the news, can see who's behind it. So, for example, one of the reasons I suspect that the Snowden story played so big, obviously it's massive revelations, but Edward Snowden himself, you could see him. You could see who was leaking it. And whether you agreed with his motivations or not, he was telling you what his motivation was. So the public could look and see, I see who's saying this to me, I decide whether I believe them or not. That's why it made the impact. If we're dealing in a world where we're going to get unknown sources, completely unknown even to the journalists themselves, with motives that are impossible for the journalists to divine, releasing information that may have been incredibly subtly doctored to tell a particular story, my concern is at that point, trust ebbs away. And you may say, well, screw you, you're a journalist, why do we care? As trust ebbs away, our influence and our impact ebbs away. And if you want journalists and media to be able to report stuff and make change in society, a set of journalists that no longer have trust and no longer have impact is not what you need. So if you still want journalists to report stuff, tech security, cybersecurity, data leaks, and so on, we need to maintain the trust, and that, at the moment, seems like a two-way street to me. Happy to take questions now. I've got a bit of time for questions, but for the moment, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you. We've got already a waving hand over here, which worries me. It's got some horrific revelation that... No, there's a mic. I think they have to pick it up maybe for the cameras. Empty jug of water. That's how Black Hat treats its speakers.
So fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. I'm curious if your last point is actually the ultimate objective of a lot of these groups, because if it's slowly degrading the credibility of media coverage around the world, that plays into the hands of a lot of different countries. So you get it all, plus you get the media disrespected and becomes less credible. You're kind of in a no-win scenario there.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. That is a concern that you achieve the objective simply by casting aspersions on something. You know, simply surrounding somebody with a cloud of doubt is enough, even if there's nothing at the center of that cloud of doubt. And my concern is by the time, because of the speed with which journalism is working and tech as a corollary of that, by the time the mist clears and you find out what's actually happened, it's too late. You know, Mossack Fonseca's closed down. You know, not have a great deal of sympathy for Mossack Fonseca, but you see what I mean? That by the time you actually catch up on it, the damage could already have been done. And what I find interesting about this is we are used to dealing with this from societies that have a strong tradition of democracy, strong tradition of independent news media, and trust in news media. We're not used to dealing with a situation where you don't know what you can trust. Generally in our history, it's like, well, you know, journalists tend to tell the truth and we can sue them if they don't. Governments tend to tell the truth because they get hauled up eventually. The idea of a world where, well, you can't trust anything, you can't trust what governments say, you can't trust what journalists say, regardless of people saying that's what they actually think, most people don't think that. Most people do think in the end, somewhere in the journalism is the truth. And if you cast doubt on all of that, I just don't think as a society we're quite ready to sort of deal with the ramifications of that, because you're just left with doubt. And I don't know whether doubt is, certainly as a journalist, doubt is not what I'm trying to foster. I'm trying to answer questions, not set. Anyway, but yeah, great question, slightly worrying. Any other questions before we move on? We've got one here from this lady there. Other conferences also have more than one microphone. They have two usually is the sort of bare minimum, I'd say. Anyway, sorry, yes, this lady here with the hand up.
I didn't really quite clearly get message through your talk on these ethical swamps. Maybe can you tell more, like, because it's in the title of the talk?
Yeah.
What you wanted to tell with this, having this in the talk, like, clearly with. What with ethical consideration did you want to highlight?
Well, I think the fact that it is a swamp, I'd hope has become clear of it. Like I said at the beginning, I can't now turn around to the end of this and say, look, the solution to this is, I don't know, that all publications have to be registered. So I don't know what the solution to that is. So the reason it's a swamp is, I don't have a nice, clear, dry path for us out of it. The reason it's an ethical swamp is this is all about not just journalistic ethics, but also about the people who work with journalists. So if you are somebody who is finding out sensitive information, you want to make it public, and you want to work with journalists to make it public, the way journalists make decisions and the way that can impact on the coverage of the leaks that you put out is something you need to have a handle on. So I was trying to describe it as an ethical swamp, basically to flag up to people that I'm not going to stand here and say, here's the patch that you download for all of the answers. So that's why that was. One more over here. Probably got time for more. In the stripy jumper.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I thought you sort of made it very clear, the challenges that journalists do face in dealing with leaked data. But obviously there is a sort of a bar of due diligence that we would expect them to cross, or to at least sort of address before publishing information from sources that they can't be sure about. And of course, yes, it can be difficult to identify, for instance, if information has been manipulated. But if you look back at the WikiLeaks leaked documents from 2016, and you look at the metadata and information from the headers and so forth, it is very clear that those have been through Russian hands at least. And obviously journalists, that is, being able to sort of dig into the technical side of this sort of leaking is not something that journalists are trained to do. But should there be an obligation there? Are there any tools that you know of to make that kind of work easier for journalists? And if not, should there be?
It's a really good question, actually. I think there was a time actually a while ago when I had a fairly dim view of journalists' ability to do tech security, both to protect themselves and their information, but also to vet the stuff that comes through to them. So but I think that's changed. I think journalists are a bit smarter about it. They know a bit more about it. The coverage I've seen from journalists, they are asking more and more piquant and particular questions about stuff that comes across their desks. But that's not the case across all media. And look, I'll just be honest about this as well. There is still a gap between journalists and techies, where journalists, particularly of a sort of older generation, just see that as something they can never get their heads around. It's too techie, I'll never understand it. So as the new generation comes up, I think they're going to get their heads around it a bit more. But also, there's an obligation to the people leaking the information or sending the information across or vetting the information to kind of work with journalists. And I think there can be more done in that. There are tools, actually. There are tools and there are organizations working with journalists who are really good on this. And I suspect, actually, the journalists that are doing a better job of vetting the information that they've got and verifying it and saying, well, look, I've checked this, I've checked that, they're going to get a better reputation. Their kudos is going to lift them further up than journalists who just say, I released this, I never really worked out who gave it to me, I don't care. And actually, the other thing I'll just mention quickly is the fact that often it's the lawyers who set the rules here. So, frankly, as a journalist, before you publish, for me anyway, the vast majority of the stuff I do, a lawyer looks across it, and oddly, it's often the lawyer who makes the final call about whether we publish this or not, because you don't want to get sued for libel. And interestingly, that set of people, much as there are good lawyers who understand tech, they're not the kind of people who want to necessarily go into every jot and tittle. But if they understand that as a journalist you have, often they'll take that, they'll say, okay, you've checked it out, you know the tech, I'll take that. But it's often the lawyer who gets the final sort of say-so on this, just to give an insight into the terror of working in newsrooms. I think, have we got time for one more? If there's one more, this chap seems desperate. Let's just do one more. Desperate in a good way, though, keen, eager to ask.
I don't know if you've heard of the Yes Men, but have you? What's your opinion on groups like that? That they basically are trolling news media, and they get to keep journalists on their toes, right? They're kind of
I see. Okay, I haven't come across.
They're called the Yes Men.
It rings a bell. Are these guys who go in and try and catch journalists out
right,
and sort of
They've done they go to talks and they do fake presentations, and they have fake representatives of government organizations that have participated on news. Newscasts. They generally make people look silly for not vetting their sources, essentially, right?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I sort of think, well, if they're exposing stuff that should be exposed, fair enough. On the other hand, as a journalist, I don't necessarily want to be on the receiving end of that. I would say there have been a couple of instances in organizations where we have been on the receiving end of that kind of stuff. People have come in and, I don't know, it's just the organizations I've worked for, we've spotted them very, very quickly. They stand out like a sore thumb. However, maybe that's because it was a little while ago and they were less good at the job. Maybe I've actually been suckered in by them in years since. But I don't know about that. Yes, I understand where that's coming from. Let's catch some journalists out and show how bad they are at verifying their sources. I get one side of that, but I also think, what have you done there? You've just damaged, again, trust in journalism. Ethical swamp. This is why I chose the phrase ethical swamp. That's an ethical swamp question. I don't know what the answer is. I can see both the good side and the bad side of that. So my opinion is, I'm not sure. It's a bad answer at the end of the question. I think that's it. We're out of time. Thank you so much for coming along. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.